The Philadelphia 76ers are one of the most interesting teams in the entire NBA this offseason. They have some huge question marks for a team that really went all in to try and win the title this year, and they got one game away from making their first conference final since 2001, but now find themselves in basically the exact same position that they have been each of the last few off seasons. A team that is close to being a real title contender that just can't get over the hump. Now, I'm not going to talk around it. I'm going to go ahead and go straight to the biggest part of this entire thing, and that is James Harden's impending free agency with the Philadelphia 76ers. Going back to last offseason, Harden had an opportunity to sign a long-term deal with Philly. They were a little bit more concerned about signing him to just a full, 4 or 5 year max contract extension, which obviously is what Harden wanted. And ultimately, they came to an agreement on a deal that was certainly a pay cut for Harden, and it was on a much shorter term for Philadelphia. Both sides kind of got what they wanted out of that, but what it means now is that Harden, who has a player option for this offseason, is almost certainly going to exercise that option. Now you're in a situation where you could have basically the exact same team next year if Harden decides to return, or Harden could be in Houston, he could be in Phoenix, he could be in a variety of different places depending on different sign and trade possibilities. And if he does leave for nothing, Philly is in a really difficult spot. You can say what you want about Harden's performances in terms of in the elimination games and in the fourth quarters of the series against Boston. He had some really good moments and then some moments that weren't so great, but regardless of that, to lose a player like that for absolutely nothing in free agency, if you're the Sixers, would be absolutely devastating. And I think that it's a real thing. I think it's a real possibility that he could re-sign back in Houston, and Philly's just looking around wondering where their borderline all-star guard just went. Now, the counter to that would be, why would James Harden want to go back to Houston? Philadelphia, despite some of the flaws on their roster that we're going to talk about throughout the entire video, represents a much better opportunity to ultimately win a title if you're James Harden than Houston does, despite the young talent there. Maybe you could make the case that 4 years from now, Houston's a better title team than Philadelphia, but none of that really matters if you're Harden, and by that point, you're going to be, 36, 37 years old, and certainly not the main focal point of the team anymore. So why would he want to go back? It doesn't make any sense. Well, there'd be one of two reasons. One, it's not basketball related, and he just wants to be in Houston. It's just a franchise that he loves, wants to be a part of once again, and it's just come full circle on that decision. Or what I think is a little bit more likely, this is a leverage play for James Harden. That pay cut that he took last offseason, he came out and said, oh, well, you guys should give me credit. I'm trying to make sure that we build the team the correct way. And it did help them, for example, bring in PJ Tucker. And had they won the title this year, I think that would have been certainly a celebrated move. But also, he wants to make sure he gets his money this offseason. And if he has another option, in this case being Houston, that has outright cap space to sign him, it gives him a lot of leverage against Philadelphia, who, as I've already explained at the beginning of this video, cannot afford to lose this guy for nothing. So I think the Houston stuff is real, but ultimately, if Philly steps up and gives him more money than Houston is able to, I do think that he's going to return, which brings us to arguably the more interesting thing about Philly, and that is the rest of this roster. Because when you look at it, they've kind of put this team together for this most recent season. You have Harden as the player option. Niang is going to be an expiring contract this offseason. D'Anthony Melton. They have the PJ Tucker contract long term, but PJ Tucker's not going to get any better than he was this year. He's still very useful for them, but there's no upside to that deal. And Tobias Harris is an expiring contract going into the 2024 offseason. All these things come together where the players that were going to help you out in the postseason, like Niang and Melton, those guys are they're cheap this year, but moving forward, it's going to be more expensive to retain them. And everything kind of centered around making your title push this year, which makes the 3-2, collapse, I would say, that much more painful for Philly. Now, having said that, that doesn't mean that there's absolutely no hope in Philadelphia. You can, even if Harden ends up leaving, put together a really good team around still the MVP of the league, Joel Embiid, and that should not get lost in this conversation. Tyrese Maxey is still awesome, and without Harden, could potentially step into that role and fulfill it maybe even better than Harden did over the next couple of seasons. It would take away, a little bit of the playmaking, of course, in the backcourt that Harden brings, and that combination between him and Maxey, but maybe the team gets a little bit more streamlined without Harden, and then with Maxey really being empowered as the guy in the backcourt. Then you do have the Tobias Harris expiring as well. It's $39 million. He's under contract for next season, but that is his expiring year. You could move that to another team that wants to dump some salary, and maybe you could take on 2 or 3 guys that give you kind of what Tobias Harris did before, but you just have more options within your rotation. And they've struggled for the last 3 years to find a way to really integrate him in a real way, especially offensively. And they probably wouldn't be too upset Tobias Harris somewhere else. But if you can't get rid of Harris and improve your roster that way, if you can't figure out how to raise the level of some of the role players on this roster, and Harden leaves, Philadelphia is just going to continue to exist in this place that they've been for a while now, and that is a second tier contender. That's just the reality of where they are. They're not on Boston's level, even Milwaukee with the collapse against Miami, like if Giannis was healthy, they would have won that series. I don't think Philadelphia is on Milwaukee's level. I don't think they're on Denver's level in the Western Conference. And they find themselves in that second tier, which is fine. Like you're going to have some chance still to win the title as they did this year, certainly by being up 3-2. But if you can't finish the deal, then having an expensive roster like this is a really bad place to be, especially when you consider some of the injury issues that Harden and Embiid have had over the last few seasons, as well as Embiid's getting a little older and he's probably getting a little bit sick of not being a bigger part of the postseason conversation here. The Sixers have not made a conference finals since 2001. It's the fourth longest conference finals drought in the league. It goes them in 2001, the Knicks in 2000, the Hornets, who have never made the conference finals, and the Wizards, who have also never made the conference finals. Those are the four longest conference finals droughts in the league, not in the East, in the league as a whole. Philly's fourth there, and they always seem to find themselves just a little bit short of their goals every single season. You can blame Harden for that. You can blame Embiid for that. There's a lot of blame to go around, but when it comes to fixing this roster, you don't actually have a lot of options. Your options are you're hoping to get something out of Tobias Harris that helps you round out your team. You're hoping to retain Harden, and you're hoping that Maxey takes a step up. And even if you lose Harden, maybe Maxey becomes the guy that you really need there. And the first domino, of course, is going to be what happens with James Harden. I would not be surprised at all if he does decide to sign in Houston for a variety of different reasons. I think right now it's about a 60% chance that he goes to Philly, 30% that he goes to Houston, and like a 10% chance that he ends up at some other random team as a result of a sign and trade. I don't think the Sixers are necessarily super excited about having to pay James Harden a ton of money in order to get him to come back. But if your options are give him a ton of money or just let him walk for nothing, they're going to really push to try and re-sign him, I think. And ultimately, it's just a really difficult situation to be in if you're Philadelphia. The path towards improving this team in a real legitimate way is really, really difficult to see. And although it was a successful season with Embiid's MVP and being one game away from making the first conference final since 2001, ultimately, if you're a Sixers fan, you're kind of right back where you've been each of the last few off seasons, where you're right there. It feels like you're really close, but maybe they're not as much of a contender as we really feel like they are. Now, if I had to guess what's going to happen for Philly's offseason, my guess would be that Harden leverages the pay cut from last season as well as the Houston opportunity and gets a 3 or 4 year full max. Like whatever Philly can pay him over 3 or 4 years, I think they'll step up, they'll pay him, and they'll hope that they're a little bit healthier next postseason, of course, because Embiid had the injury issues, during the playoffs. They'll hope that Maxey gets better. They'll sign him to an extension. They'll probably explore trading Tobias Harris, but ultimately your options for getting good value out of him, guys that actually help you, are pretty limited. And, maybe they'll look to trade a future first or a couple of second round picks, try and improve the roster along the edges, and then just run it back. Like, I really feel like that's the situation they're in, where even if it looks a little bit tough in terms of maybe we're not top tier contenders, they almost beat Boston. They arguably should have beat Boston. They had game 6 at home, up 3-2 in the series. They were up in the fourth quarter and they let the game get away from them. And if they close out game 6, we're looking at this roster in a completely different way, because they would have had a fantastic chance to make the finals. And I think if they do make the finals, all the Houston Harden rumors go away. They're really motivated to retain him. And even if they don't win the title, there's proof of concept here for a Harden Embiid combination. And after game 5 of that Boston series, they looked like the team to beat in Eastern Conference and a guaranteed finals team. And you don't want to let just 2 games skew what you think of your roster too much. If after game 5, if you're Philly, you were really excited about your team, thought you finally broke through, just because it didn't happen doesn't mean that without some tweaks, without some adjustments, without potentially some better health luck, it couldn't happen for you. And really, when you're at the point that Philly is, and you're already kind of all in, you're already kind of committed to making this happen, especially when you have an MVP level player like Embiid on your roster, you can't really, run it. You can't really roll it back and say, oh, just kidding, we don't really want to compete anymore. We're going to rebuild around Embiid and trade Maxey, or not trade, or sign and trade Harden and be like a 5 seed next year. Like, you can't really do that at this point if you're Philly. So really their only option is pay Harden too much to run it back or let him walk. And I mean, maybe they're still like really, really good contenders, but at this point, it's just a really difficult situation to be in if you're Philadelphia.